I now present the final testament.
This changes everything.
You can't be serious. I wish I could tell you this all meant something more. I know you understand. I think this detail connects everything.
It's this envelope. Look here.
You're right.
It's her.
She's the one.
Not so fast.
The dates on these documents match the handwritten letter.
This photograph confirms it. It's all connected.
We're finally breaking through.
Everything is going to be all right now. I know it will. We have each other.
The cruelest thing about being betrayed by family is that everyone expects you to stay silent. Emily Carter stared at the rain sliding down the window of her small apartment as her phone buzzed again on the kitchen counter. She already knew who it was before she looked. Another message from a cousin she had not heard from in months. Another reminder that her mother was gone. Another reminder that, somehow, she was standing completely alone. At 34 years old, Emily was the daughter nobody defended. At least that was how it felt. While her older sister Olivia seemed to move through life collecting praise, support, and admiration from everyone around her, Emily always seemed to be the one people doubted. When Olivia started a business and failed, the family called her brave. When Emily worked 2 jobs to pay off student loans, they called her irresponsible for not earning more. When Olivia missed holidays, people said she was busy. When Emily missed one Thanksgiving because of work, they whispered that she did not care about family. It had been that way for years. Her mother, Margaret Carter, had always tried to keep peace between her daughters, but even she could not stop the quiet divisions that grew over time. Now Margaret was gone, and the distance between the sisters felt wider than ever. Emily picked up her phone and read the message. The family would gather the next morning at Margaret's house before the attorney officially reviewed the estate documents. Everyone was expected to attend. Emily sighed and placed the phone back down. The apartment around her was modest but clean. A second-hand couch sat against one wall. A small dining table occupied the corner near the kitchen. She had worked hard for everything she owned. Nothing had been handed to her, yet somehow that never seemed to matter. Outside, the rain grew heavier. Her thoughts drifted back to the final weeks of her mother's life. Margaret had become weaker with each passing day, but one thing had never changed. Every time Emily visited, her mother would squeeze her hand and tell her how proud she was. Those words meant more to Emily than any amount of money ever could. Still, something bothered her. During one of their last conversations, Margaret had started to say something important. She had looked toward the hallway, lowered her voice, and begun a sentence she never finished because Olivia had suddenly entered the room. Emily could still remember the strange expression on her mother's face. Concern, urgency, almost fear. At the time she had dismissed it. Now she found herself replaying the memory over and over. The next morning would bring the entire family together. Most of them would support Olivia without question. Most of them already viewed Emily as the disappointing daughter who never quite measured up. She knew exactly how those conversations would go. The sympathetic smiles, the awkward greetings, the silent judgments. What Emily did not know was why her mother's unfinished sentence refused to leave her mind. And as the storm continued outside her window, she could not shake the feeling that something important had been hidden from her all along. By the time Emily arrived at her mother's house the next morning, the driveway was already full. Cars lined both sides of the street, and clusters of relatives stood near the front porch speaking in low voices. The familiar white colonial home looked exactly as it had for years, yet everything felt different without Margaret Carter inside. Emily stepped out of her car and immediately noticed how conversations seemed to pause as she walked past. A few relatives offered polite smiles. Most simply nodded. She was used to it. Inside, the living room had been arranged with extra chairs facing a large oak table where attorney David Reynolds organized several folders. Emily had known David since childhood. He had handled family legal matters for decades and had always been professional and fair. Seeing him there gave her a small sense of comfort. Olivia sat near the front of the room wearing an elegant black dress and an expression that seemed almost too calm for the occasion. Several relatives surrounded her, offering support and sympathy. Emily quietly took a seat near the back. As the room filled, David stood and thanked everyone for coming. He spoke briefly about Margaret's life, her generosity, and her love for her family. Then he opened a folder and began reading. At first everything seemed routine. A few charitable donations were listed. Personal items were assigned to distant relatives and close friends. Then David reached the section everyone had been waiting for. The estate included the family home, several investment accounts, retirement savings, and a substantial amount of property accumulated over many years. Emily listened carefully, expecting to hear that everything would be divided equally. That was what her mother had always said. That was what everyone assumed. Instead, David paused, adjusted his glasses, and continued reading. According to the document before him, the entirety of Margaret Carter's remaining estate would pass solely to Olivia Carter. Emily felt as though the air had been pulled from the room. For several seconds she thought she must have misunderstood. But the silence that followed confirmed otherwise. Her name appeared nowhere among the beneficiaries. Not one account, not one property, not one keepsake. Nothing. Around the room, people exchanged shocked looks. Then came the whispers. Emily heard fragments of conversations spreading through the crowd. Some wondered what she had done to disappoint her mother. Others speculated about arguments they assumed had happened behind closed doors. No one questioned the document itself. They questioned her. Emily slowly turned toward Olivia. Her sister looked surprised for only a brief moment before lowering her eyes and accepting comforting words from nearby relatives. The reaction seemed rehearsed somehow, though Emily could not explain why. David appeared uncomfortable as he continued reading the remaining provisions, but the damage had already been done. By the time the meeting ended, the atmosphere had completely changed. Relatives who had greeted Emily warmly earlier now avoided eye contact. One aunt quietly suggested that mothers always had reasons for their decisions. Another relative hinted that Margaret must have known something the rest of the family did not. Emily stood frozen beside the window as everyone prepared to leave. She could barely process what had happened. Her mother had spent years telling her that both daughters would always be treated equally. So why would a final document erase her completely? As people exited the house, Emily looked toward the hallway where she remembered her mother's unfinished sentence weeks earlier. The question that had haunted her all night now felt impossible to ignore. Something about this did not make sense. Emily barely remembered the drive home. The road blurred beneath the gray afternoon sky while the words from the will repeated endlessly in her mind. By the time she reached her apartment, several missed calls and text messages were waiting for her. None offered comfort. Most carried the same quiet assumption. Margaret Carter had chosen Olivia for a reason. Emily set her phone aside and tried to focus on something else. But the messages kept arriving. One cousin wrote that she hoped Emily would respect her mother's final wishes. Another relative suggested that family disagreements were often hidden from outsiders. Each message felt like another judgment. Nobody asked how she felt. Nobody questioned whether the document reflected what Margaret truly wanted. They simply accepted the story that Emily had somehow failed her mother. The following days became even more difficult. Family members who once greeted her warmly now seemed distant. Invitations stopped. Conversations ended quickly. Even simple condolences carried an uncomfortable tone. Emily felt as though she had been placed on trial without ever being told the charges against her. Meanwhile, Olivia appeared to settle naturally into her new role as sole heir. Photos appeared online showing relatives visiting the family home. Comments praised Olivia for handling everything with grace. One evening Emily saw a picture of Olivia standing beside Margaret's favorite rose garden. Dozens of supportive messages filled the page. Emily stared at the image and felt a sharp sense of disbelief. Her mother had spent years caring for that garden with both daughters beside her. Now it was being treated as though it had always belonged to Olivia alone. Yet beneath the hurt, another feeling was beginning to grow. Doubt. Not doubt. about herself, but doubt about the story everyone else seemed willing to accept. Margaret had never been careless. She had always organized every detail of her life. She kept records of everything. Birthdays, receipts, letters, family photos, even old report cards were carefully stored and labeled. The idea that she would suddenly remove one daughter entirely from her estate felt impossible. A memory surfaced again. During one of her final visits, Margaret had asked Emily to help organize papers in her study. While sorting documents, Margaret had smiled and said, "One day, everything will make sense." At the time, the statement seemed harmless. Now it felt different. Later that week, Emily returned to the family home to collect a few personal belongings her mother had promised her years earlier. Olivia was already there. The conversation between them remained polite but cold. As Emily moved through the house, she noticed something unusual. Margaret's study door was locked. In all her years growing up there, she had never seen that door locked. "Why is the study closed?" Emily asked. Olivia hesitated for only a second before answering. She claimed she was organizing paperwork and did not want anything disturbed. The explanation sounded reasonable, but something about her tone felt forced. As Emily prepared to leave, she glanced once more toward the hallway. The locked study sat at the far end, silent and untouched. For the first time since the reading of the will, she felt certain of one thing. The answers she needed had not disappeared. They were still somewhere inside that house. The image of the locked study refused to leave Emily's mind. For the next several days she tried to focus on work, but every quiet moment brought her thoughts back to the house. Her mother had spent countless hours in that room. Important documents, family records, personal letters, and decades of memories were stored there. If Margaret had left behind any clue, Emily believed it would be inside that study. Late Friday afternoon, an unexpected opportunity arrived. A neighbor who had been close friends with Margaret called to ask whether Emily could stop by the house to collect several photo albums that had been set aside for her years earlier. Olivia was reportedly busy meeting with financial advisors and would not be home until evening. Emily hesitated only briefly before agreeing. When she arrived, the house felt strangely empty. The silence made every room seem larger than she remembered. She collected the photo albums from the dining room and prepared to leave, but her eyes drifted toward the hallway once again. The study door stood exactly where it always had. Closed. Waiting. Emily walked toward it almost without thinking. She tested the handle. Locked, just as before. Frustrated, she turned away. Then something caught her attention. A small brass key hung inside a decorative bowl on a nearby table. The bowl had always sat in the hallway, and Margaret often placed spare keys there. Emily stared at it for several seconds. She knew she should leave. She knew Olivia would likely be angry if she entered the room. Yet another thought pushed back. If her mother had wanted the study completely hidden, why leave a key in plain sight? Her heart began to race. Slowly, she picked up the key and approached the door. To her surprise, it fit perfectly. The lock clicked open. Emily stepped inside. Nothing appeared unusual at first. Books lined the shelves. Family photographs filled the walls. Margaret's desk sat neatly arranged near the window exactly as it had for years. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight. The room felt untouched. Emily moved carefully through the space. Several filing cabinets contained tax records and household paperwork. Drawers held old greeting cards and journals. Everything seemed ordinary. Then she noticed something strange. One drawer in the desk showed signs of recent use. Unlike the others, it slid open effortlessly. Inside she found empty folders. Their labels remained, but the documents were gone. One label immediately caught her attention. Estate planning. Another read personal correspondence. A third read family distribution notes. Emily's pulse quickened. Someone had removed the contents recently. She continued searching and eventually discovered a small notebook tucked behind several books on a lower shelf. The handwriting belonged to Margaret. Most entries contained simple reminders and daily notes. But near the final pages, Emily found a short handwritten sentence that made her freeze. It read, If anything happens, the letter in the blue envelope explains everything. Emily turned every page again. No envelope. No explanation. Nothing. Just that single sentence. She searched the desk, the shelves, and every cabinet she could access. The blue envelope was nowhere to be found. As she stood alone in the study, one fact became impossible to ignore. Her mother had left behind a message. Someone knew about it. And before Emily entered that room, someone had already made sure it disappeared. Emily left the house carrying the notebook in her purse and more questions than answers. The sentence about the blue envelope echoed in her mind throughout the weekend. If Margaret had written that message herself, then the envelope had existed at some point. More importantly, someone had removed it. The question was who. On Monday evening, Emily sat at her kitchen table reviewing everything she knew. The will had excluded her completely. The study had been locked. Files connected to estate planning were missing. And now there was evidence that Margaret had intentionally left behind additional information. None of it felt accidental. Determined to find answers, Emily began contacting people who had been close to her mother during her final months. Most conversations led nowhere. Friends shared stories about Margaret's kindness, her gardening club, and her volunteer work at the local library. Yet one conversation stood out. A retired neighbor named Helen Brooks mentioned something unusual. Several weeks before Margaret passed away, she had spoken excitedly about finishing an important letter. Helen remembered the conversation clearly because Margaret had joked that the letter would finally help her daughters understand something she had struggled to explain for years. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Did she say where she kept it? Emily asked. Helen paused before answering. She remembered Margaret mentioning a blue envelope and saying she planned to place it somewhere safe until the right time came. The detail matched the notebook perfectly. Emily thanked her and ended the call, but another mystery immediately appeared. If the envelope had been stored safely, how had it vanished? The following day, she decided to speak directly with attorney David Reynolds. She scheduled a meeting at his office and brought the notebook with her. David listened carefully as she explained everything she had discovered. When she showed him the handwritten note, his expression changed. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the page for several moments. "This is definitely your mother's handwriting," he finally said. "I have seen enough of her signatures and personal notes over the years to recognize it." Emily asked the question that had been haunting her for days. Could a missing letter affect the validity of the will? David chose his words carefully. He explained that a personal letter alone would not automatically override a legally executed estate document. However, if the letter contained information about Margaret's intentions or referenced other evidence, it could become extremely important. Before Emily left, David revealed something unexpected. A few days after Margaret's death, Olivia had requested immediate access to several personal files stored in the house. At the time, he had not considered it unusual. Now he was no longer certain. Emily thanked him and walked toward the parking lot. As she reached her car, her phone rang. The caller identification displayed a name she did not recognize. She almost ignored it but answered anyway. The elderly voice on the other end introduced himself as Walter Green. He explained that he had worked with Margaret at the library for years. Then he said something that made Emily stop breathing for a moment. "I think your mother asked me to hold something for her," he said quietly. "And after everything I have been hearing lately, I believe it is time we talked." Emily arranged to meet Walter Green the following afternoon at a small coffee shop near the public library where he had worked alongside Margaret for nearly 15 years. The moment she arrived, she recognized him from old photographs. He was in his 70s, neatly dressed, and carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime helping others. After exchanging greetings, Walter reached into a worn leather briefcase and carefully removed a sealed envelope. It was blue. Emily stared at it without speaking. For a moment, she could only hear the sound of her own heartbeat. Walter gently placed the envelope on the table but did not let go of it immediately. He explained that Margaret had given it to him about 2 months before her death. She had been unusually serious that day. According to Walter, Margaret told him that if anything happened to her and confusion arose within the family, he should contact Emily directly. At the time, he thought she was simply being cautious. Only after hearing rumors about the estate did he begin to suspect the envelope might matter. Emily carefully opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter spanning several pages. Every line was unmistakably written by her mother. As she read, tears filled her eyes. Margaret explained that she loved both daughters deeply and intended to divide her estate equally between them. She wrote that fairness had always mattered to her and that neither daughter should receive more than the other. Yet another section of the letter caught Emily's attention even more. Margaret described growing concern over several disagreements she had experienced with Olivia regarding financial matters during her final year. She did not make direct accusations, but she admitted feeling pressure to make changes she did not agree with. Near the end of the letter, Margaret wrote something even more startling. She mentioned a conversation that took place in her study approximately 6 weeks before her death. During that conversation, another person had been present. Someone she trusted completely. Someone who heard everything. Emily lowered the letter and looked at Walter. "Do you know who she was talking about?" she asked. Walter nodded slowly. The witness was not him. It was Rachel Simmons, Margaret's longtime volunteer coordinator at the library. According to Walter, Rachel had helped organize several community projects with Margaret and often visited the house during her final months. Emily immediately asked for Rachel's contact information. Before leaving, Walter shared one final detail. A few days after Margaret's funeral arrangements began, Olivia had visited the library searching for personal materials connected to her mother. At the time, Walter thought she was simply gathering keepsakes. Now he was no longer sure. That evening, Emily called Rachel. The woman sounded hesitant at first but agreed to meet the next day. As the conversation ended, Rachel quietly said something that sent a chill through Emily. "Your mother knew something was wrong," she said. "That is why she asked me to stay in the room. And what I heard that day is something I have never forgotten." The next afternoon, Emily met Rachel Simmons at a quiet park overlooking a small lake on the edge of town. Rachel arrived carrying a folder and an expression that suggested she had spent days deciding whether to speak. After they sat down on a wooden bench, neither woman spoke for several moments. Finally, Rachel looked directly at Emily and said she had regretted staying silent for far too long. Emily listened carefully as Rachel described the meeting that took place in Margaret's study 6 weeks before her death. Margaret had invited Rachel over to discuss a charity project, but the conversation changed when Olivia unexpectedly arrived. According to Rachel, Margaret had been reviewing estate documents and discussing plans for dividing everything equally between her daughters. At first, the discussion remained calm. Then Olivia began arguing. She insisted that she deserved more because she had spent years helping manage family matters. Margaret disagreed. Rachel remembered Margaret saying that love was not measured in dollars and that fairness mattered more than convenience. The conversation became uncomfortable enough that Rachel considered leaving. Before she did, she heard Margaret say something she never forgot. Margaret stated clearly that both daughters would receive equal shares and that no one would pressure her into changing her decision. Emily felt tears forming as Rachel repeated the words. They sounded exactly like the mother. She remembered. Rachel then opened the folder she had brought. Inside was a printed email Margaret had sent several days after that meeting. In the message, Margaret thanked Rachel for her friendship and briefly mentioned feeling troubled by family tensions involving her estate. While the email did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing, it reinforced everything the letter in the blue envelope had described. Emily realized the pieces were finally beginning to fit together. Yet she also understood that proving the truth would be far more difficult than suspecting it. Rachel explained that she had remained silent because she did not want to become involved in a family dispute. After hearing about the will, however, she became increasingly uncomfortable. The version of events being accepted by the family did not match what she personally witnessed. Before they parted ways, Rachel made a promise. If necessary, she would publicly testify about everything she heard. That evening, Emily met with attorney David Reynolds and shared the new information. David carefully reviewed the letter, the notebook entry, the email, and Rachel's statement. By the end of the meeting, his concern was obvious. While none of the evidence alone guaranteed a legal victory, together it painted a troubling picture. David then revealed something important. A memorial gathering honoring Margaret's life was scheduled for the following weekend. Nearly every relative, friend, and community member would attend. Olivia planned to speak during the event. Emily expected David to recommend immediate legal action. Instead, he surprised her. He suggested patience. Rushing forward without preparation could allow rumors to overshadow facts. If the truth was going to emerge, it needed to happen where everyone could hear it at the same time. Emily drove home thinking about his advice. For weeks she had felt isolated while others accepted a story that never made sense. Now she possessed evidence, witnesses, and questions that demanded answers. As the memorial approached, she made a decision. She would not confront Olivia privately. She would wait, and when the moment came, everyone who had judged her would finally hear the truth for themselves. The memorial service drew a larger crowd than anyone expected. Friends, neighbors, former co-workers, distant relatives, and members of the community filled the church hall to celebrate Margaret Carter's life. Large photographs stood beside arrangements of white flowers, and stories about Margaret's generosity echoed throughout the room. Emily sat quietly near the back while Olivia occupied a seat in the front row surrounded by supportive family members. For most of the afternoon, everything unfolded exactly as planned. People shared memories. They laughed softly at old stories. Some wiped away tears as they spoke about the kindness Margaret had shown during difficult moments in their lives. Then Olivia stepped to the podium. She thanked everyone for attending and spoke confidently about honoring their mother's legacy. As she talked about family, unity, and respect, Emily noticed several relatives nodding in agreement. Months earlier, that scene would have broken her heart. Now she simply listened. When Olivia finished, Attorney David Reynolds slowly approached the podium. The room immediately grew quiet. Most people assumed he intended to offer closing remarks. Instead, he explained that before the gathering ended, several important documents connected to Margaret's final wishes needed to be addressed. Confused murmurs spread through the audience. Olivia's expression tightened. David then invited Emily to join him. For the first time, dozens of eyes turned toward her without judgment or dismissal. Emily walked to the front carrying the blue envelope. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. She explained how the letter had been discovered and how it had been entrusted to Walter Green before Margaret's death. David confirmed the authenticity of the handwriting. Then he began reading the letter aloud. As Margaret's words filled the room, the atmosphere changed. Guests listened in stunned silence while Margaret clearly described her desire to divide her estate equally between both daughters. Several relatives exchanged shocked glances. Others looked toward Olivia. The letter alone would have been surprising enough, but it was only the beginning. David next introduced Rachel Simmons. Standing before the audience, Rachel calmly described the conversation she personally witnessed in Margaret's study. She repeated Margaret's exact statement about fairness and equal distribution. Then David presented the email Rachel had received afterward. By now the room was completely silent. Olivia attempted to interrupt, insisting that the evidence proved nothing. But before she could regain control of the situation, David revealed one final discovery. After reviewing records connected to the estate files, investigators had confirmed that documents had been removed from Margaret's study shortly after her death. Several missing folders corresponded directly to the materials Margaret referenced in her letter. The pattern was impossible to ignore. No dramatic accusation was necessary. The facts spoke for themselves. One by one, relatives began realizing they had accepted a story without asking questions. Faces that once carried certainty now reflected disbelief. Olivia looked around the room searching for support, but none came. For weeks she had stood as the unquestioned heir. In a matter of minutes, everything changed. And as Emily looked across the audience, she understood that the truth her mother had tried so hard to protect had finally reached the people who needed to hear it most. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of the memorial gathering continued to unfold. Attorney David Reynolds formally reopened the estate review process and submitted the newly discovered evidence for examination. As additional records were analyzed, the picture became clearer. Margaret's true intentions had never changed. She had always planned to divide her estate equally between her daughters. The missing documents, the letter, the witness testimony, and the supporting records all pointed to the same conclusion. For the first time since her mother's passing, Emily felt something she had not experienced in months. She felt peace. The feeling did not come from the possibility of receiving money. It came from knowing that her mother had not abandoned her. The doubt that had weighed on her heart since the reading of the will finally disappeared. One by one, relatives began reaching out. Some apologized for believing the worst. Others admitted they had judged her too quickly. A few confessed they never questioned the situation because it seemed easier to accept the official story than to search for the truth. Emily listened politely but carried no desire for revenge. She understood that grief often clouded judgment. More importantly, she remembered the values her mother had spent a lifetime teaching her. Compassion mattered, integrity mattered, and truth mattered most of all. Eventually, the estate was adjusted to reflect Margaret's documented wishes. The family home, the investments, and the remaining assets were divided equally. Yet what surprised many people was Emily's reaction. She did not celebrate. She did not boast. She did not seek recognition. Instead, she focused on honoring her mother's memory. One portion of her inheritance was donated to the library programs Margaret had loved for years. Another portion funded scholarships for local students who needed support pursuing higher education. When reporters from a local community newspaper asked why she chose that path, Emily answered with a simple smile. She said that her mother spent her entire life investing in people and that continuing that legacy felt more important than any financial victory. As for Olivia, the distance between the sisters remained. Trust, once broken, could not be repaired overnight. Yet Emily refused to carry bitterness. She hoped that one day healing might be possible, but she understood that some lessons required time. Several months later, Emily returned to the family home on a quiet autumn afternoon. The rose garden bloomed beautifully beneath the golden sunlight. She walked slowly along the familiar path and stopped near the bench where her mother often sat reading. There, she unfolded the letter from the blue envelope one final time. As she reread the words, she realized something important. The greatest gift Margaret left behind was never the house, the accounts, or the property. It was the truth itself. Truth had restored her mother's voice when others tried to silence it. Truth had restored her reputation when others doubted her. And truth had revealed the love that had been there all along. Emily carefully folded the letter and looked across the garden. For the first time in a very long time, she felt her mother's presence not through grief, but through gratitude. The story that began with loss had ended with understanding. And in the end, that was the inheritance that mattered most.
Sometimes the deepest wound is not come from a stranger, but from family. Emily's story reminds us how easily to judge someone before we know the truth. After her mother passing, she was misunderstood and abandoned by those who should have trusted her most. Instead of choosing anger, she choosing patience, compassion, and honesty. In the end, Emily's greatest inheritance is not a family home or the money. It was a certainty that her mother loved that never changed. That truth gave her something more valuable than wealth. It is peace. Life has a way of revealing what is hidden. Lies may last for a while, but truth has the power to restore trust, heal a broken heart, and silence false accusation. As you leave this story, remember one simple lesson. Before you judge someone, make sure you know the whole story. Our greatest legacy is not by what we own, but by the kindness we show, the integrity we protect, and the truth we choose to live by. If you like this story, remember to like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment below. Thank you for watching.